Today, the world is home to 5 billion people, each one needing enough food to live. Their survival is possible only because of the agricultural revolution. To sustain human life, food must be produced in every corner of the globe, some for subsistence and some as surplus for trading across the world. Wheat from the prairies of Canada, beef from the vast stockyards of the American Middle West, rice from the paddy fields of the East. Foods from Asia and America, from Australia and Africa, are bought and sold throughout the world. But all this depends upon farmers. They have to find a way to feed a world growing more crowded and more hungry every day. Agriculture and the production of food for consumption and sale is the result of a revolution which began about 10,000 years ago, a relatively short time in the long span of human history. The transition from hunting and gathering to settled farming communities was one of the most decisive transformations in human history. Without this agricultural revolution and the increased supply of food, human population could never have grown from the tiny societies of early men and women to today's bustling cities. Modern agriculture, despite all its technology and mechanization, is still, in principle, the same as it has always been. The soil is prepared and the seed is planted. The growing crop is tended until ripe, when it is harvested, and then the soil is prepared again for the next seeding. The harvest is the culmination of the agricultural year, when the fruits of man's labor are gathered in. A modern combine can harvest up to 5 acres of wheat an hour, each acre yielding up to 4 tons of grain. Such production was beyond the wildest dreams of the early farmers. But modern agriculture and its enormous capabilities are the end product of a process which began some 10 millennia ago. Without the development of agriculture and the cultivation of the soil, modern urban society would be impossible. And as population increased, so has the output of the world's farmers to meet the demand for food. The enormous range of food on the shelves of the local shop or supermarket is something we take for granted today. Fresh fruit all year round. Pre-packaged meats and dairy products. Processed vegetables from around the world. Canned foods, and foods from a host of plants and animals from across the globe. This is the latest stage of an agricultural revolution that began before recorded history. Looking back from the perspective of the 20th century, we can summon up images of primitive men and women. They were hunters and gatherers. They hunted, fished, and foraged for their food, gathering nuts and fruits and scratching with crude stone implements among the roots. The origins or causes of the agricultural revolution are mysterious, but certainly the beginnings of agriculture seem to be connected with climatic changes. Today, where climatic conditions make agriculture impossible, a few groups, Eskimos in the frozen Arctic, Indian groups in parts of the Amazon jungle, Bushmen in Africa, and Aborigines in Australia still rely on hunting, fishing, and gathering for their livelihood. About 10,000 years ago in the Near East, things started to change. Wheat and barley grew wild on the edge of the mountain ranges between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and between the Caspian and the Persian Gulf. Instead of gathering the wild heads of wheat, men and women began to cultivate them. The first farming villages grew up between 8,000 and 7,000 BC, next to the upland zone where there was enough rainfall to sustain agriculture. It was around these mountain villages that cereal cultivation first began. Einkorn, emmer. It seems they were the common forms of early wheat. The selection and breeding of the best strains of plants was a crucial aspect of the agricultural revolution. As a result of genetic changes and the domestication of wild cereals, early farmers were able to grow ever higher yields of grain. Today's varieties of wheat are the end result of centuries of domestication and selection. Early farmers would select the best strains and plant the seed, as in these modern drawings. They would tend the plants during the growing season, harvest the crop when it was ripe, then turn it into food or store it until it was needed. Next, they would prepare the ground for the seed to be planted for the coming year. In essence, these are the principles of farming, and the annual cycle of the agricultural year is the same today as it was for the first farmers. This was the beginning of cereal cultivation. Bread, we say, is the staff of life. But wheat is only one of the many wild plants which were domesticated and cultivated. In China and much of Asia, rice is the staple food. An equally important crop is maize, or corn, as it is now often called. Maize was first cultivated thousands of years ago by the native inhabitants of modern Mexico. It was so important to them that they regarded it as sacred. As with other ancient peoples, the villagers turned the sacred into an object of worship. They petitioned favor from Chunchutlique, a fertility goddess, associated with the growing of maize. The potato, easily grown in many different parts of the world, has now become a staple element of our diet. In the 16th century, Spaniards returning to Europe from Peru brought the potato along. Within 200 years, the potato was all the rage on the continent. The potato and its relative corn are the great contributions of the Americas to our basic food supply today. The World, a television history, will continue on TLC. The introduction of farming began independently in different parts of the world and spread slowly. It continues to advance today, where new lands are brought under cultivation. In Europe, agriculture spread out gradually from its home in the Near East, along the coast of the Mediterranean and up the river valleys into Central and Western Europe. Advancing at an average rate of only a mile a year, agriculture finally reached the British Isles about 6,000 years ago, spreading into Russia some 1,000 years or so later. Inaccessible mountains and highland areas were left untouched by advancing agriculture. The existence of the first European farming villages is often impossible to see on the ground today, but aerial infrared photographs can just pick out, behind the patterns of today's farms, the dim outline of these early agricultural settlements, like this one called Saint-Mussac, and this one at Saint-Maurice-de-Loncare in France. The first European farmers worked the soil beyond these early enclosures. As agriculture expanded, the economies of the world developed a marked zonal pattern. Hunting economies survived at both the northern and southern extremes. In the temperate zones, developing alongside the domestication of plants was the domestication of animals. The cereal cultivators found it inconvenient both to grow and hunt, and so animals for food came to be herded near the farming villages. Man's effect on the animal world was as dramatic as his role in developing new plant species. Today, it does not seem unusual for millions of animals to be bred, fattened, and slaughtered for human consumption. 10,000 years ago, the ancestors of cattle, sheep, pigs, and other animals were not domesticated by man, but were running wild through the forests and over the plains. As agriculture spread into the arid zones where climate and soil were not suitable for extensive crop cultivation, new forms of animal keeping were developed. This new farming was called pastoralism and was characteristic of the dry zones of North Africa, Northern America, and Central Asia from about 3000 BC. The Pastoral Revolution was every bit as important a stage in human history as the Agricultural Revolution. Many of the pastoralists were highly mobile. They lived and tended their flocks in the vast open landscapes of the arid belt that runs across Asia and Africa and separates the temperate zone of the north from the tropical forests of the equator. Away from the great river valleys, life depended upon mobility to take advantage of scattered seasonal pastures. Nomadic pastoralists followed their flocks hundreds of miles in the quest for grazing lands, often living in tents, as some of them, like the Bedouins, moving across the deserts of Arabia, still do today. With the domestication of plants and animals, the dimensions of human life completely changed. The result was an increasing number of men settling down with their families in one place. The migratory life of hunters following their prey gave way to sedentary life. Sheep, pigs, cattle were penned in on permanent pastures close to their settlements. Once agriculture began, people were tied to the land in a way they had not been previously. Agriculture led to a more settled existence, and in time to the beginning of village life. The spread of farming gave rise to scattered village communities, with men and women raising crops and tending flocks. In many parts of the world, that style of life lives on to this day. The World, a television history, will continue on TLC. It is often thought that the agricultural revolution dawned in the Near East. It was in the upland zones that the wild ancestors of wheat and barley had grown. The cultivation of these crops soon spread down into the plains, where early farming villages developed. Eventually, agriculture spread into the more fertile valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, great rivers cutting across the arid Syrian desert. On the banks of these rivers today, the remains of the first urban settlements can be found, like this one at Ashur. As the area of cultivation spread, new problems arose. The supply of water had to be controlled. Initially, this involved making the most of the sparse rainfall. This led to the introduction of irrigation, the making of trenches and ditches to divert water into the fields. In the great valleys, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Nile in Egypt, the Yalu River in China, the problem was different. All these rivers were fed by seasonal snowmelt or monsoonal rain, with torrential floods breaking the riverbanks and spreading across the flat, open country. Here the problem was how to retain the floodwaters to nurture the crops during the hot, dry summer. Today, traditional methods of irrigation are still found, alongside more modern techniques of dam building and flood control. Agriculture had a profound impact upon human history. The new supplies of food from the cultivation of crops mark out the early farming communities from the hunting and gathering societies which had preceded them. In a hunting and gathering economy, it takes thousands of acres to feed a single family. It's been estimated that in a primitive agricultural economy, it required only 25 acres. The task of solving the problems of cultivation and irrigation led to the emergence of more complex societies. Such problems were beyond the resources of individuals or single families. Growing the necessary amounts of food called for cooperative efforts that could only be solved by organization, as visualized in these illustrations. But who would be in charge of irrigation and other public works? Who would resolve disputes? There must have been a village chief allocating work and possibly settling arguments over land. Here lie the dim origins of political organization. At the same time, the agricultural revolution created a surplus of food. The population began to grow rapidly. People no longer had to live from day to day. Communities and skills developed and diversified, requiring even higher levels of societal cooperation and order. As the surplus grew, an increasing variety of plants like figs, dates, and olives were brought into cultivation. With more abundant food, human population experienced its first surge, increasing approximately 16 times between 8,000 and 4000 BC. The foundations of civilization were being laid. By today's standards, however, the Earth was still a very small planet. It was home to a relatively tiny number of humans 6,000 years ago, only a few million or so. The centers of intensive agriculture were still few and far between. Cities and urban civilizations still lay well in the future. But once the agricultural revolution made the use and ownership of land a decisive factor, it inevitably had far-reaching social and political consequences. As early as 10,000 years ago, in a few especially favored places, people were moving from the countryside and scattered village settlements into larger communities. The best known is Jericho in the Jordan Valley, surrounded by a legendary stone wall which survives to a height of 11 feet. Even more spectacular is Çatalhöyük in Turkey, dating from 6000 BC. It covered 32 acres of tightly packed brick and stone buildings. Jericho, Çatalhöyük, and other similar centers were certainly remarkable, considering that the original settlements were built by people who used stone tools and had not reached the stage of making pottery. But they were isolated, precocious developments. After being inhabited for 1,500 years or more, Çatalhöyük simply disappeared. Jericho and Çatalhöyük were not towns in our modern sense. They were merely enlarged villages. But simply by existing, Jericho and Çatalhöyük became harbingers of a new age. They demonstrated that as populations grew, the demands of agriculture and irrigation would call for greater cooperation, more ordered communities, and more complex societies. The agriculture revolution made it possible to feed the world's people, now beginning to gather in cities, city-states, and empires. This newly created abundance of food nourished the next great phase of world history, the birth of civilization.